The rain poured down mercilessly over the streets of New York, as if the sky itself was breaking apart. The icy wind sliced through the air, making Elena shiver uncontrollably. She clutched her torn, soaked coat tighter around her body, but it did little to shield her from the cold. Water streamed down her face as she sat on a bench, her tired eyes scanning the towering buildings in the distance. Each passing moment deepened the ache in her chest. How had her life become this endless fight for survival? Across the street, Ryan Collins stepped out of the gleaming high-rise that bore his family's name, Collins Enterprises. His tailored suit and polished shoes glistened under the streetlights. He was lost in thought, his mind tangled in the frustrations of a business deal gone wrong. Focused on his worries, he didn't notice the sedan speeding recklessly toward the crosswalk he was about to step into. Time slowed. Elena noticed the car first, a flash of metal cutting through the sheets of rain. Her pulse quickened as she saw the man in the suit walking straight into danger, oblivious to the imminent disaster. Without thinking, she pushed herself to her feet, adrenaline surging through her veins. Fear clawed at her mind, but her body moved on instinct. She sprinted forward and, with all her strength, shoved the man out of the car's path, feeling the hard impact of the pavement beneath her as she fell. The car sped past them, missing by mere inches. Water splashed violently around them as Ryan stumbled onto the sidewalk, stunned but unharmed. He lay there for a moment, gasping for air, before his eyes found the woman sprawled on the wet street. "Oh my God," he whispered, pushing himself upright, still dazed. Elena groaned softly, gripping her arm. Pain seared through her body, but she forced herself to sit up. Warm blood trickled down her arm, but she didn't seem to care. Her eyes were locked on him, silently ensuring he was still alive. For a few long seconds, the only sound was the relentless downpour and the distant hum of the car disappearing into the night. Ryan finally spoke, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "You saved me. Why would you do that?" Elena didn't answer right away. She was too drained to explain, too weary from years of hardship to offer a detailed reply. Finally, she murmured, "Nobody should die like that." Alone, her voice was low, almost drowned out by the rain, as if she were speaking more to herself than to him. Ryan blinked, taken aback by the weight of her words. He glanced down and saw the blood on her arm. "You're hurt. We need to get you some help," he said urgently. But Elena stepped back, her eyes wary and guarded. She knew people like him didn't get involved with people like her. "I'll be fine," she replied, her voice faltering with exhaustion. Ryan wasn't convinced, and neither of them knew just how profoundly this night would alter both their lives. Did you enjoy this part of the story? Then give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next exciting episodes. Ryan couldn't shake the image of Elena standing in the rain, her worn-out clothes soaked and clinging to her thin frame. Something about her eyes, those weary, haunted eyes, refused to leave his mind. As he sat in the back seat of his chauffeured car, the city lights flashing by, he replayed the moment over and over. He should have insisted she let him help. She saved his life. Yet, she walked away as if her own pain didn't matter. The next morning, Ryan found himself unable to focus on anything. His assistant, Thomas, noticed his distraction. "Sir, are you all right? You've been staring at the same document for 20 minutes. Ryan blinked and sighed. "Thomas, I need a favor. Can you look into something for me?" He hesitated for a moment, almost embarrassed by the request. "There was a woman last night. She saved my life. I need to find her." Thomas raised an eyebrow but didn't question him. Within hours, he had a report on Elena. Ryan learned her full name, Elena Martinez, and her story hit him harder than he expected. She had once been a promising art student with dreams of opening her own gallery. But life had dealt her blow after blow. Her mother's death, mounting debt, and eventually homelessness. Ryan's chest tightened. He had always believed in pulling oneself up by sheer willpower, but seeing her reality challenged that belief. Later that evening, Ryan stood near the entrance of a public shelter where Thomas said Elena often stayed. He felt out of place in his expensive overcoat, receiving wary glances from people passing by. Finally, he spotted her near the back of the line for the shelter. Her face was pale, and she clutched her injured arm as if she hadn't had it treated. Without thinking, he called out, "Elena!" She froze, slowly turning to face him. The disbelief in her eyes was evident. "You again? What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone guarded. Ryan stepped closer but kept his voice gentle. "You're hurt. I couldn't just forget about what you did for me." He hesitated for a moment before adding, "I owe you my life." Elena gave a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "You don't owe me anything. People like you don't come looking for people like me." Her voice carried a mixture of exhaustion and suspicion. But Ryan wasn't deterred. "I want to help. Not because I feel sorry for you, but because I see someone who's been through more than anyone should have to endure." His sincerity caught her off guard. For the first time, Elena wasn't sure whether to push him away, or trust that perhaps this man might actually mean what he said. Elena crossed her arms tightly, her gaze hard and suspicious. "You want to help? What does that even mean?" she asked, her voice laced with skepticism. Ryan hesitated. He knew any offer of financial assistance would likely insult her pride, so he chose his words carefully. "Let me take you to a doctor. That cut on your arm could get infected," he said softly. "Then, maybe we can talk over dinner?" she scoffed, shaking her head. "Dinner? Do you think this is some fairy tale where you swoop in and fix everything with a hot meal?" There was an edge to her voice, but it masked the fear that clung to her like the cold. She had been let down too many times before to believe in kindness without strings attached. "Look, I don't need charity," she added, turning away as if to end the conversation. Ryan took a step forward, speaking before she could walk away. "It's not charity. You saved me, Elena. I'm not trying to fix you. I just want to return the favor." His tone was calm but insistent, and for a moment, she paused. No one had spoken to her like that in years, without pity, without judgment. Slowly, she let out a breath and nodded, though her guard was still up. "Fine. Just the doctor. No dinner." Within an hour, they were at an urgent care clinic. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead as a nurse cleaned and stitched Elena's wound. Ryan sat silently in the corner, his presence both comforting and surreal to her. She watched him from the corner of her eye, trying to make sense of why he was here. "You don't have to stay, you know," she muttered. "People like you have better things to do." "People like me?" he repeated with a raised eyebrow. "I think you have the wrong idea about me, Elena. I grew up with money, yeah, but I've lost people too. And believe me, money doesn't shield you from that kind of pain." His voice softened as he spoke, and Elena caught a glimpse of something real, something vulnerable, beneath the polished exterior. It unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. When the nurse finished, they stepped outside into the cool night air. Elena's thoughts raced as she glanced at Ryan, who seemed in no hurry to leave. "So what now?" she asked quietly, her voice losing some of its earlier hostility. He smiled gently. "Now I take you somewhere warm. No pressure. Just let me do this." She hesitated again but finally nodded, exhaustion loosening the walls she had spent years building. Maybe, just maybe, it was okay to trust someone for now. The small corner diner was quiet, its booths mostly empty except for a few late-night regulars. The smell of coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air as Elena and Ryan sat across from each other. She kept her hands wrapped around a steaming mug, savoring the warmth. It was the first time in weeks she'd felt something other than cold. Despite that, her body remained tense, her mind racing with questions. Why was he really here? People didn't just go out of their way for someone like her. Ryan studied her in silence for a moment. He could see the doubt etched into every line of her face. "You don't trust me," he finally said, not as a question but as a statement. Elena met his gaze, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Can you blame me?" she retorted. "You show up out of nowhere, wanting to help me like it's some kind of redemption arc for you. I've seen this before. Rich guy feels guilty, throws a few bucks around, and then vanishes when things get inconvenient." Her words stung more than he expected, but Ryan didn't flinch. "I'm not here to throw money at you," he said firmly. "I don't know exactly what I'm doing, to be honest, but I know I owe you. And maybe I just want to understand." He leaned forward slightly, his voice softening. "You risked your life for a stranger. Why?" Elena went silent, her eyes dropping to the table. She ran a finger along the edge of the mug, her thoughts drifting to memories she usually kept buried. "My mom always said, you don't walk away when someone's in danger. You do what you can, even if it costs you," she whispered. Her voice wavered slightly, and she blinked quickly to push back the sting of tears. "She was all I had. After she died. Well, life didn't exactly go easy on me after that." Ryan nodded slowly, sensing the deep wound behind her words. He didn't press her for more, understanding that some scars weren't meant to be reopened all at once. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, and for the first time in a long time, Elena didn't feel patronized by those words. There was sincerity in his voice, a genuine empathy that caught her off guard. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was no longer uncomfortable, it was almost comforting. Ryan glanced around the diner, then back at her. "You said you used to paint?" he mentioned, recalling the details from Thomas's report. "Do you still do it?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "Not for a long time," she admitted. Life didn't leave much room for dreams, but as she said it, something stirred inside her. A faint spark, buried but not entirely extinguished. Elena stared out the window of the diner, watching raindrops trail down the glass like tiny rivers. Ryan's question echoed in her mind. "Do you still paint?" She hadn't thought about her art in years, not since the night she was forced to sell her last painting just to survive. For a moment, an old dream resurfaced. Her hands covered in paint, the thrill of a blank canvas waiting to come alive. But reality quickly smothered the thought. Dreams didn't keep you warm at night. Ryan noticed the way her expression shifted, the brief flicker of something that looked like both longing and pain. He wanted to say something comforting but knew that words alone wouldn't break through her walls. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and placed a business card on the table. "I'm not expecting anything from you, Elena," he said softly. "But if you ever decide you need help with anything, just call me." He tapped the card lightly and leaned back, giving her space to absorb his offer. Elena's eyes dropped to the card. Ryan Collins, CEO. The words seemed almost surreal. A part of her wanted to rip it in half and walk away, to cling to the familiar safety of distrust. But another part, buried deep within, whispered something different. What if this really was a chance? Not for charity, but for something more. She slid the card into her coat pocket, though she wasn't ready to admit why. "I don't make promises," she said, her voice guarded but less hostile. Ryan smiled faintly, sensing a subtle shift in her demeanor. "Fair enough," he replied, as the waitress brought their food, pancakes for her, coffee and toast for him. Elena felt an unexpected pang of hunger. She hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. The smell of warm syrup and butter was almost overwhelming. Tentatively, she took a bite, the sweetness flooding her senses. For a moment, it was as if the weight on her shoulders lifted just a little. The two of them ate in relative silence, but it was a different kind of silence now, one that didn't feel heavy or tense. Elena found herself glancing at Ryan occasionally, curious about this man who had every reason to walk away yet kept choosing to stay. "So, what's your story?" she finally asked, breaking the quiet. "You don't seem like the typical CEO who's too busy to care." Ryan chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Trust me, I didn't plan to be here tonight. I grew up in a family where success was everything. My dad drilled into me that emotions were a weakness. But after losing my mom, I started seeing things differently. I guess I've spent most of my life trying to prove I'm more than just the rich guy everyone expects me to be." His voice carried a hint of sadness, and Elena realized that maybe he was just as lost as she was, in his own way. Do you think Elena should trust Ryan or keep guarding herself against disappointment? If you had the chance to help someone rediscover a forgotten dream, what would you do? Share your thoughts below on what you think will happen between Elena and Ryan. We can't wait to hear from you. Elena let Ryan's words hang in the air. Her fork paused halfway to her mouth. There was a vulnerability in what he had just shared that she hadn't expected. She had always assumed that people like him lived perfect lives, untouched by real pain. Yet here he was, revealing cracks beneath the polished surface. It stirred something in her, an unfamiliar sense of understanding. "Losing your mom. That must have been hard," she said quietly, her voice carrying a rare gentleness. Ryan nodded slowly, his gaze distant. "She was the only one who really saw me," he admitted. "My father always cared more about appearances and profits. But my mom, she believed in people, in giving second chances." He stopped, shaking his head as if trying to push away a flood of memories. "I think she would have liked you," he added softly. His eyes met Elena's, and for a moment, they shared an unspoken connection. Two people shaped by loss in different, yet eerily similar, ways. Elena shifted in her seat, uncomfortable with the intimacy of the moment. She wasn't used to letting people in, especially not someone like him. "You barely know me," she said, trying to downplay his words. "You might not think that if you knew everything." There was a bitterness in her tone, a hint of the burdens she carried. Ryan didn't push for details, though his curiosity was evident. Instead, he gave a small shrug. "Maybe, but I don't believe people are just the worst things that happen to them." His words hit harder than Elena expected. For years, she had defined herself by her failures and hardships, as if those moments were all she'd ever be. Now, someone was suggesting that maybe she was more than that. It was unsettling, yet strangely comforting. She sighed and leaned back in her seat, letting the warmth of the diner seep into her bones. "You talk like you've been through therapy," she muttered with a faint smirk. It wasn't quite a joke, but the tension between them eased. Ryan chuckled. "Let's just say I've had a lot of time to think. Money doesn't fix everything, no matter what people think." He paused, taking a sip of his coffee. "But I do believe it can help, if you let it. Maybe not to solve all your problems, but to create opportunities you might not have otherwise." Elena stared at him for a long moment, weighing his words. She hated the idea of relying on anyone, but there was also a truth to what he was saying. She had spent so long surviving that she hadn't dared to imagine what it would be like to live. As they finished their meal, the rain outside began to ease into a soft drizzle. Ryan pulled out his wallet to pay, but Elena reached across the table and grabbed his wrist. "I don't want handouts," she said firmly. "I'll find a way to pay you back." Her eyes burned with determination, and for the first time in years, she felt a spark of control over her own fate. Ryan smiled, not with condescension, but with quiet respect. "Deal," he said, and for the first time that night, Elena felt the smallest glimmer of hope. The next morning, Elena awoke to the distant hum of traffic and the muted gray light of dawn filtering through the window of the shelter. For a brief moment, she almost forgot where she was. The warmth from the previous night, the diner, Ryan's words, lingered like an echo, but reality quickly crept back in. She rubbed her temples and sighed. She had survived this long by trusting no one. Was she really about to let some wealthy stranger into her life? Meanwhile, Ryan sat at his office desk, unable to concentrate. His father, David Collins, had called earlier that morning, scolding him for missing a business dinner with an important investor. "You're distracted, Ryan. We have responsibilities. Stop wasting time with whatever personal project you're working on," his father had snapped. Ryan clenched his jaw as he ended the call. It was always the same: numbers, profits, control. Yet, last night's conversation with Elena had stirred something deeper in him, a desire to break away from those expectations and actually make a difference. Later that afternoon, Ryan made his way to a park where Thomas had said Elena might be. He found her sitting alone on a bench, sketching absent-mindedly on a scrap of paper. She didn't notice him at first, her focus entirely on the faint lines taking shape, a silhouette of a woman standing in the rain. "That's really good," Ryan said softly, startling her. She quickly folded the paper and shoved it into her coat. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice defensive but less harsh than before. "I wanted to check in," he replied casually, sitting beside her. "And maybe talk about that deal you mentioned. Finding a way to pay me back." Elena raised an eyebrow, crossing her arms. "You're not going to offer me some cushy charity job, are you?" "Because I'm not interested in being anyone's pity case." Ryan chuckled lightly, shaking his head. "No charity. But I have a project in mind. You mentioned you used to be an artist. What if you helped me with something involving that?" Elena hesitated, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "What kind of project?" she asked cautiously. Ryan leaned forward, his tone serious but encouraging. "I've been thinking about starting a community program. Something to support people who've had a rough time getting back on their feet. Art classes, mentorships, things like that. I don't have all the details worked out, but I need someone who understands what it's like. Someone like you." For the first time in what felt like forever, Elena was speechless. No one had ever asked her to be a part of something that mattered. Her instinct was to question his motives, but a part of her, small and fragile, wanted to believe this was real. "You're serious?" she finally whispered. Ryan nodded. "Completely. But only if you want to. It's your choice." She looked away, the paper in her pocket crinkling softly. Maybe, just maybe, this was a chance to start over, not by forgetting the past, but by shaping a future that could finally belong to her. Elena stood in front of the studio Ryan had arranged. A modest, sunlit space tucked in the corner of a community center. The walls were bare, the smell of fresh paint lingering in the air. Wooden easels were lined up neatly, waiting to be used. She traced her fingers over one of them, the texture of the wood grounding her in the present. Part of her still struggled to believe this was real. "You sure about this?" she asked, glancing over at Ryan, who stood by the doorway watching her reaction. "As sure as I've ever been about anything," he replied with a small smile. "It's not much yet, but with time, it could be something important." He stepped forward, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "I know this is a lot. I don't expect you to trust it right away. But I think you have something to give, Elena. Something that could inspire people who've lost hope." Elena looked away, the weight of his words settling in her chest. She wasn't used to being seen as someone who could help others. Most of her life had been about survival, scraping by without a moment to think about dreams or purpose. But standing here, in this space filled with potential, she felt a strange mix of fear and excitement. Could she really do this? "What if I mess it up?" she asked quietly, her voice barely audible. Ryan's expression softened. "Then you try again. No one gets it perfect the first time. And you're not alone in this." His words hit deeper than he probably intended. Not alone. Elena had been on her own for so long that the idea of having someone to lean on felt foreign, almost impossible. But she didn't push him away this time. She nodded slowly. "Okay, I'll try." Over the next few days, Elena found herself spending more time at the studio than she expected. At first, it was just small tasks, organizing supplies, setting up materials, but gradually, she began sketching again. Her lines were hesitant at first, as if her hands had forgotten how to create. But with each stroke, the fear began to melt away. Memories of her mother's encouragement whispered through her mind. "You've got a gift, Elena. Don't let anyone take that from you." One evening, Ryan stopped by the studio to check on her. He watched quietly as she worked on a large canvas, lost in concentration. The painting depicted a city street at dusk, bathed in soft, golden light. It was both haunting and hopeful. "That's incredible," he said softly, breaking the silence. Elena turned, startled, and then shrugged awkwardly. "It's just something I've been working on," she mumbled. But deep down, she felt a spark of pride. For the first time in years, she was creating again, not just surviving but truly living. Elena's progress at the studio had not gone unnoticed. Word of the art program spread throughout the community, and soon, people began trickling in, young and old, each carrying their own burdens. Some were eager to create, while others just needed a safe space to breathe. Elena found herself unexpectedly stepping into a mentor role, guiding hesitant hands and sharing her techniques. Yet, with each small success, a familiar weight crept into her mind. The fear that it could all crumble in an instant. That fear resurfaced one evening when she spotted a man from her past standing at the edge of the studio entrance. He was someone she had hoped to never see again. Eric, an old acquaintance who had been part of the reason she ended up on the streets. His presence hit her like a punch to the gut, dredging up painful memories of betrayal and loss. Her hands trembled as she set down her brush. "What the hell are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice sharp and tense. Eric raised his hands in mock surrender. "Relax, Elena. I'm not here to cause trouble," he said with a smirk that made her stomach churn. "I heard you were doing better these days. Thought I'd check in." His words dripped with insincerity, and Elena's walls shot up instantly. "You don't get to check in on me," she hissed. "You were part of the reason I lost everything. You have no right to be here." Ryan arrived moments later, sensing the tension as soon as he walked in. His eyes flicked between Elena and Eric, instantly reading the situation. "Is everything okay?" he asked carefully. Elena hesitated, her heart pounding. She didn't want Ryan or anyone to see this side of her life. But Eric's presence was like a wound being reopened. "Yeah," she finally muttered, her voice tight. "He was just leaving." Eric chuckled but took a step back. "Fine, I'll go. But don't think you're better than the rest of us just because you got lucky with some rich guy's help." He sneered before turning and walking out into the night. Ryan frowned, watching him disappear. "Who was that?" he asked gently, his concern evident. Elena exhaled shakily and sat down on a nearby stool. "Someone I used to know," she said flatly. "Someone who reminded me why I stopped trusting people in the first place." She rubbed her hands together, trying to steady herself. Ryan crouched beside her, his voice calm but firm. "You're not that person anymore, Elena. You've fought your way back, and no one gets to take that from you." For the first time, she allowed herself to believe him just a little, but she also knew that facing her past might be the final test she needed to overcome. Days passed, but Eric's visit lingered in Elena's mind like a dark cloud. She had always feared that the ghosts of her past would return to haunt her success. Each night, the doubts crept in. What if he was right? What if all of this is temporary? What if I'm just fooling myself? The questions kept her awake, gnawing at her newfound confidence. Yet every morning she forced herself to return to the studio. People depended on her now, and she couldn't let them down, not after how far she had come. One afternoon, as Elena was organizing a workshop for the community, a familiar voice caught her attention. "Hey, Elena," a young girl hesitantly greeted her. It was Sophie, one of the first participants in the program. Sophie had come in weeks ago, quiet and withdrawn, her drawings full of shadows and fear. Now, she stood with a small, hopeful smile, holding up a sketch of a vibrant landscape. "I just wanted to thank you for everything," Sophie said softly. "You made me believe I could be good at something again." Elena felt a lump form in her throat. For years, she had seen herself as broken and lost, incapable of helping anyone. But here was proof that she had made a difference. "You did that on your own, Sophie," Elena replied, her voice thick with emotion. "You just needed someone to remind you." The girl beamed, and in that moment, Elena knew. Her art wasn't just about the canvases anymore. It was about people, about healing, hope, and second chances. Later that evening, Ryan stopped by the studio, carrying a small wrapped package. "What's this?" Elena asked, eyeing the package suspiciously. He grinned. "Open it slowly." She unwrapped the gift to reveal a set of high-quality brushes and paints. It was more than just art supplies. It was a symbol of belief in her potential. "You've earned this," Ryan said softly. "And I think you know that now." Elena nodded, her eyes stinging with tears she no longer felt the need to hide. "Thank you," she whispered, not just for the gift but for everything he had done. For seeing her when she couldn't see herself. For the first time in years, she felt whole, as if the shattered pieces of her life were finally being rebuilt. "I never thought I'd be standing here, doing this," she added, gesturing to the studio. You didn't just survive, Elena. You reclaimed your life, Ryan said, his voice full of pride. They stood in silence for a moment, the hum of the city fading into the background. Elena glanced around the studio, her heart full of gratitude and possibility. This was her new beginning, and for the first time, she believed in it. Truly. And that's it. What did you think of this emotional story? If you believe everyone deserves a second chance, hit that like button below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more inspiring stories like this one. Click on the notification bell to stay updated on all our new content. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.